No audio from the courtyard.
That's nice. There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Thank you for coming today. I know it's a cold day out there, and there's still a lot of snow and ice, but we appreciate you coming out and spending part of your day with us. My name is Todd Arrington. I'm the director here, and welcome to the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. Thank you for joining us for the first lunch and lecture program of 2025. Great turnout. Very happy to see you all here. Thanks so much for coming. Our 2025 annual theme for programming here this year is Saluting Our Veterans. To kick off our series, we're honored to welcome Dr. William Meadows, presenting virtually for us today. He's a professor of Anthropology and Native American Studies at Missouri State University. Dr. Meadows is the author of 7 books, 5 of which focus on Native American veterans. And I'll also tell you that we've met and we've recorded a podcast on this subject. So there will be additional information out here for you by the end of the month in the form of a podcast about this topic as well. So we're very excited to learn more about Native American veterans, and we're very happy to welcome Dr. William Meadows. So Bill, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much for having me today. Just waiting for the slides to appear so I can go forward here. So
They're loading right now. It might just be
Okay.
a moment. So if you want to just start with kind of giving a little bit of background.
Sure.
They're loading right now.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out today, and thank you to the Eisenhower Presidential Library for having me. Just briefly, I've been working in the field about 36 years, and I began work, I think the first thing I did with Code Talking was back in '89, actually, and everything. So it's still going on. I'm still working with some new groups that have not yet been recognized yet, and actively doing research on this is one of the topics I work with. And with that, I'll just take off. I'm going to give you an overview of Native American code talkers in both world wars, World War I and World War II and everything. So Native American code talkers, a lasting legacy. So I always dedicate these talks to this gentleman here. This is Forrest Castavoid, who was Comanche. And Forrest and I were working on another project during my dissertation, which had to do with Native veteran ceremonial societies. And he happened to be a headsman in one of those. And that's what he's dressed for right there in the picture, one of their dance societies. And one day we got off the subject and we're talking about World War II. And I asked him what his MOS was, and he kind of chuckled and said, well, it'll say this on my discharge paper, but me and 16 other men were recruited in basically the December of 40 and January of 1941 to go through basic and then advanced training, and eventually to form a code. That was our assignment, to form a code in our native Comanche language. I just lost the picture again. Okay, thank you. And so he encouraged me to contact the other gentlemen in the unit that were still with us, as well as their training officer, who was still with us as well. And he wanted me to write up an article on this. And I said, well, Forrest, I'm right in the middle of my dissertation, you know. And he kind of scoffed, and he said, well, that can, you put that on the shelf for a while, that can wait. And I'm not sure he understood what a dissertation was, but he was right. And about the same time that I met him and started working with him real closely, my grandfather passed, who was a World War II veteran, and it dawned on me these men are all in the same cohort, and I needed to make time to do this. So I literally started this project while I was doing my dissertation, and went from there. Okay, I need to images, please. Okay, thank you. Okay, so how and why did Native American code talking develop? And so we're all familiar with the time span that World War I was involved. The United States tried to remain neutral for a while, even though we were supplying Britain and France. And of course, we got into it in 17 and really heavy from the end of 17 on and everything. Well, basic problem that we had here was communication security. And so American troops at this time, basically you had a handful of primary ways to send messages in the front there. So you had phones between companies, but these were largely connected by wire. And so any German could click into a message or click into a wire, and it just became a party line where they could sit and listen to our conversations. There were distance listening devices that the Germans used, which worked off of a magnetic coil and could pull a transmission at a safe distance, and they could just sit and listen to it, basically. There was a buzzer phone that we had, which deals with coding messages that have to do with lights and buzzing sounds of different durations and patterning, but it's very slow to use. And of course, that was another problem, was the messages needed to be fast. They needed to be immediate and everything. And then we had runners who could physically carry a handwritten message, but 1 in 4 of them were generally being either shot or the message intercepted, one or the other. So we needed secure and immediate communications, and we needed something faster than the coding and decoding methods that we had available at the time. So these groups here are who are going to be drawn upon. And so the basic situation is that different division officers got together and spoke and said, you know, everything we do, the Germans are listening, they can hear us. And this became apparent in some conversations where officers were talking, and they made a comment about one made a comment about the Germans have been shelling us all morning, but they're about 100 meters off. It's not doing us any damage. And then the artillery was right in on top of them. And so they realized that they were being listened to. So there was one case where a false message was sent to move troops, supplies, armaments to a particular hill, and that location was sent as part of the regular message. And then they waited and watched, and precisely at the time that they were to be there and set up, the hill was just exterminated by German artillery. So that confirmed that they were being compromised. So the idea that came up was several of these divisions unto themselves realized, well, we have a number of Native American soldiers in our unit, and they clearly speak their language. They sit around and visit in it all the time amongst themselves. Maybe we could have them send the messages. So the idea to do this was not in the military manual, not in instructions or anything. It was a battlefield experiment to solve an existing problem right there on the spot at the time. There does not seem to be, we have no record of any parent organization of this throughout the Army. In other words, there was a plan that was implemented in different units. It seems to be different units came up with similar ideas as they faced this situation. So we have 3 of the 7 groups in World War I that we have documentary evidence for. 3 of them we have an actual timeline, so we know within a day of when they started using their languages to send messages. And the first being the Ho-Chunk, or who are popularly known as the Winnebago, from Wisconsin. The second being the Eastern Band Cherokee from North Carolina. And then both Choctaw and Cherokee from Oklahoma being used in another. And these are staggered out over the kind of the middle of the summer through the fall of 1918. So all this came fairly late in the war, as we'll see, but it was very useful and had an impact. So some of the documentary evidence, for example, to show you, this is a copy of a letter home that Robert Big Thunder wrote. He was wounded at Chateau Thierry, where he and his brother-in-law had been using Ho Chunk to send messages. And he wrote home to his father explaining he was wounded, he was evacuated, but he was okay. He was in the hospital. But some of the things that they had been doing, and he described using his language to send the messages and everything. This is his quote unquote Indian soldier card in the National Archives. And it says Robert Big Thunder, full blood Winnebago Indian, wounded in France, over the top 3 times, also adopted the Indian code signal. The term code talker would not come in until 1944. So they generally just called these guys talkers or Indian talkers or things of that nature and everything. And so we have both his written letter home as well as his card and everything of independent sources of confirmation here. This is in the 30th Division, which is from North Carolina, South Carolina. These are Eastern Band Cherokee. And so this is out near St. Quentin and Cambrai. And the Americans are kind of stalled out here. They're not making good progress. Every time they do something, again, the Germans are a step ahead. And they have a meeting of the signal battalion officers. And Captain John Stanley remembers he was in, like a lot of individuals, he was in the National Guard before they were federalized and activated. And he said, well, there was a large number of Cherokee boys in the National Guard before we federalized. So when you're federalized, everybody just goes from that day until the end of the war. And so he said they have to be here still in the unit. So they culled a number of these individuals together and started using Cherokee and made progress. And he was reassigned a few days after they started leaving it, but they didn't start until early October in 1918. The reason we know so much about this is that he was taking an advanced officers course in 1931 at Fort Benning, and he was in a class where they had to take a situation from World War I in which they had a problem and how they solved or remedied that problem. So he wrote up the situation in the context of how the Cherokee were used here. Now, unfortunately, we do not know how many were used, and we also do not know the names of these individuals. But I ran the rosters for the 119th and 120th regiments, and there are many distinct Cherokee names and soldiers active duty there. So we don't know how many were used, but it's clear they were in the unit, and Stanley documents their use. So this was around October 6th and 7th. Now, the third instance of a dated use we have, this isn't part of the Meuse-Argonne campaign. And so you see the map up the upper left there. So the arrows are pointing towards Sedan. So at this stage in the war, after Chateau Thierry and Verdun and some of these areas, the goal was to push in this sector of the American line, to push towards Sedan. Sedan was a major railway network and crossroads in which Germany needed to supply half of its army one direction, half the other. The Americans knew if we can take Sedan, we can sever the rail line, and basically half of the German army cannot be resupplied or remanned or relieved anyway. So while they're pushing towards that, they come towards a little place called Forest Firm. So in the upper right part of the screen here, this was a peninsula. It was elevated, so it's kind of like a thumb that was raised up, higher than the surface around it. The Germans had retreated across the Ain River in this sector, except for this peninsula, and they held this high ground here. So you had complete visual command of anyone approaching you or things of this nature. There was roughly 500 Germans in this small peninsula. It's called Forest Farm because it's a very heavily wooded area, and there was an old farm there. The French were sent twice to take it, and they were repulsed with very heavy losses by the Germans. So the 36th Division from Oklahoma and Texas was brought up, and they were assigned this. So they were aware that the Germans were listening in. They were also finding German phone lines as they retreated that were being left intact, hoping the Americans would use the German lines, and the lines were still active, of course. So an order came down to Captain E.W. Horner there, and he's in the picture. He's the taller gentleman in the picture there with 5 Choctaw natives. There were 8 Choctaws that were, they asked him, they said, do you have 8 of the native boys in your unit that speak good English, perfect Choctaw, etc.? And he said, yeah, I've got quite a few, because a lot of them had been through the boarding school situation and they were fluent in both languages. So 8 were taken. They were spread out, and it's not elaborated on, but I think there was one at each company for a sector up and down the line here. What happened was they sent a couple messages out earlier in Choctaw, and so they knew the Germans were overhearing or listening to it. But A, they wouldn't know what language it is. B, they'd never figured out in the time that they had. And so this allowed the 36 forces to get in position and everything. They set a 20-minute artillery barrage. So the lines across the peninsula are the 3-minute increments that the artillery is creeping forward. And what they did was they had the messages sent in Choctaw. They had the troops rush dangerously close behind the artillery, but the artillery was coordinated in, so that as soon as the artillery ceased, they were on top of the position. And so in a matter of in moments, they killed approximately half of the German forces that resisted and took the other half captive, and then had mop-up work for those that had retreated further back in the peninsula. So later that night, there was also evidence that they were sending medical messages and supply messages. They continued to use Choctaw for that as well. So it was used possibly several times in this evening. Following this action, and it showed again, the Germans basically lost 500 troops here. The Americans only lost 14, and some of the 14 were from errant artillery fire of their own, friendly fire. That was off by a little bit. So it was clear that they completely surprised the Germans, caught them unprepared, etc., and that this was a valuable technique to use it. The Choctaw then were relieved after a couple days. They went back to a rest camp, and the group was increased from 8 to 18, and also 3 non-commissioned officers under a Cheyenne lieutenant. And the reason there's so many natives in this regiment, in this company, it came primarily out of southeast and eastern Oklahoma. So Company E, when it originally formed, was entirely native except for the non-commissioned officers. And as the war went along, there were some individuals as relief transferred out of it and non-Indians brought in, but the company always remained probably half or more native. And it had, at one point, it had the ability to speak 26 languages. So there were many individuals to draw upon, and Choctaw, being one of the largest groups, was the one that was sought, and then also the Cherokee. This is a card for Calvin Atchevett. He was in the 90th Division. There is a situation where part of the 90th, which was also Oklahoma and Texas, but western Oklahoma, he and 4 other Comanches were in a unit there in the 90th and everything. There's a section where some of them are cut off and surrounded, and so aid is needed. And what they rely upon is having him call back and send the messages in Choctaw, again, figuring no one will be able to identify what it is or know, Comanche, and be able to break the Comanche language. So we also have his Indian card, and you'll see where it says, the Belgian government had given him the French or Belgian War Cross for talking over the lines when they were surrounded by the enemy. His Comanche tongue got messages across that were not understood by the enemy. And so he was actually presented the Belgian War Cross specifically for using his language. And we had the son of one of the other World War I veterans in his unit that I interviewed. His dad had told him about how they had used the Comanche to send artillery and to do some other things as well. So this is just a table very quickly of the 7 groups in World War I that I've been able to identify. There are allegations of the Cheyenne, but I have never found any evidence. And the Cheyenne Nation has contacted me, and they don't have anything either. So that one is still a little bit up in the air. But the others we have definite mentions of and records for some of these groups and everything. Again, most of them are coming from Oklahoma, but there were also some Lakota from the Dakotas and some Osage use as well. Now, one of the real popular myths about code talking is, and I run into this still repeatedly, is that this was all secret. All these gentlemen took pledges and were required to, promise and things of that nature. Now, that's going to be true for the Navajo in World War II. There were great efforts to keep that secret, even though there were leaks eventually, great efforts to keep that secret. But in World War I, there was nothing like this. And the way, my reason for arguing this is that the very Army officers that used it immediately after the war were doing newspaper interviews, writing articles to the newspapers, talking about it in public speeches. And, it's kind of described as a slick trick. It was kind of like, look what we pulled on the Germans, kind of thing. And they identified tribes that are being used and how it was used and everything. But here's a couple newspaper articles. And if you notice, the one in the upper left, it's originally run in Flagny, France on February 27th, 1919. And it talks about exactly the Choctaw Indians, the company, so forth and so on. This was reprinted in the U.S. the next month. And then over on the other side, you see where it says in the Daily Oklahoman, Indian tongue used as code to dodge spies. And so again, it's talking about the Choctaw and things of this nature. So this was widely covered after the war in articles, and there was simply no effort to secrete it whatsoever. No one thought we were going to have another world war because, as we always say, this was the war to end all wars, right? So it was just, again, an impromptu experiment that worked, and several groups made use of it during World War I. So after World War I, there are some French decorations for individual Choctaws and other native soldiers as well, but they're not for code talking. There's nothing done about this. And of course, that today, of course, in contemporary times, we think, well, this was a unique service. Why weren't they singled out and recognized and everything? And a lot of times you have to realize in the military, whatever comes up at that spot, you take care of. So there are times where cooks, for example, with the Cherokees, one of the guys was a cook. He was pulled off the line to send messages in Cherokee. It's just what you needed to do and asked to do, and you took care of it. And at the same time, there's personnel staff that sometimes had to become riflemen on the spot. But after the war, everyone was, thrilled they survived, went home, and there really wasn't any question from the men themselves or their officers about potentially recognize them or anything. There's a few mentions about code talkers. Like I say, a lot of them in the newspaper, some autobiographies that the officers wrote, a lot of them recorded very, very detailed campaign diaries and things and mentioned in a couple pages using these men and everything. There are some individuals like Joseph Oklahomby, who later on we realized was not a code talker, but he was in this immediate unit, was offered a movie offer because he had done he had captured and taken quite a number of German troops, kind of similar to what Sergeant York did, Sergeant Alvin York. But he declined the movie offer because he didn't want to go to California and be away from Oklahoma again. So there's really no U.S. recognition. But the Army remains aware of it. They're aware of what these guys did. It's in the Army records. And a lot of this has to do with a survey. that newspaper article that was reprinted immediately after the war. There was a gentleman named John Eddy. He had been the superintendent at Crow Indian Reservation in Montana. He was gassed late in the war, and while he was recovering, they were looking for something that he could do that wasn't physically demanding. And he said, well, he was familiar with native cultures to some degree, having worked with the Crow Reservation. He said, I would like to do a survey of the Native American experience in World War I, talk to the men, interview their officers, etc. So he got permission to do that and sent out questionnaires to lots and lots of units. And of course, those that had the biggest amount of Native soldiers are the ones that responded much. So that letter that got published is actually the letter that Colonel Alfred Bloor wrote for the 36th division that ended up getting printed as a newspaper article. So this de facto survey is what really preserved a lot of the information that we have about the World War I code talkers. And had it not been for that survey, a lot of it would be even more lost to time. So pre-World War II, we have the boarding schools are still going, and that's going to be the final irony of all of this is, of course, all these men, World War I and II, the vast majority went through government boarding schools. Now, if it was an off-reservation school, it was generally a lot more strict than some of the on-reservation schools. And the experiences of the men in World War I were a little different than the ones in World War II. But boarding schools were still discouraging native language use. Even after the Indian Reorganization Act, which guaranteed, the rights of speech and religion and culture and some of those things, it was still being discouraged and everything. But most of the gentlemen, that I interviewed from this era, even ones that were not soldiers, they came out of the boarding schools. The majority were still fluent in their languages and could speak them and everything. And so they took this when they went into service. So again, I said the Army is still aware of this. And so the Army actively starts recruiting as late as 1939 with some groups, but they recruit two groups in the Great Lakes area, the Oneida from Wisconsin and a Chippewa or Anishinaabe group from Michigan, and they end up in a division. The Comanches, a group is recruited from Oklahoma. A group of Meskwaki. Many of you might not recognize that name, but if you've heard the name Sac and Fox, the Meskwaki are the Fox part, and Meskwaki are what they refer to themselves as. And then there's a small group of Hopi later that are actually already in service, but they are actually transferred and culled and brought together to create another unit in the Army. These are the only units in the Army that were formally recruited specifically to learn codes, to develop codes, etc. There's going to be a lot of others that do it unofficially, as we'll get to. But these were the ones that were actually recruited, created coded vocabulary, etc. So as we know, we got into the Pacific in 42, but we didn't really get into Europe until 44, of course. North Africa earlier than that in 42. But the armed forces had a series of meetings in 1943 and 44. So we're well into the Pacific, but we've not yet went into Normandy yet. And we're not all the way through Italy yet either. And they're really questioning, should we use Native Americans to send messages? What's the feasibility? Should we expand this? Should we, whatever? And the biggest issue, there are people that point out that, well, it worked in World War I. There was no question of interception or, anything like treason or anything like that on the natives' part. They did a fine job and it worked well in its areas. But the reticence, as some signal officers from this era pointed out to me, the reticence was not necessarily just because it's Indians, but it's because none of us can speak these languages. So absolutely none of us can monitor these languages to know how accurate they are. Is it conveying exactly what we need, etc.? You're basically just putting your trust in a group of communicators of another language. So unfortunately, The Navy decided, they tested some code talkers and natives. They said, it's okay. We just don't really need it for our setting, for our kind of settings. The Army basically said, we'll keep the small units that we have. And the units were only, they were only really between 8 to 17 men. They were pretty small units and everything. But we're not going to expand the program or recruit anymore, et cetera, and everything. So the Army keeps it has, but doesn't expand those. But within the Army, both in the Pacific and Europe, numerous officers take initiative upon themselves to say, well, if I have a small contingent, even sometimes 2 men who speak the same native language, I'm going to make a radio team out of them, and pull them into that. And so there's other groups of 3, of 4, of 7, of 5, etc., where company commanders start using natives as radio men. And again, it has the same basic impact. They don't have all the formally devised code words, but it's still good enough because they're fluent speakers. It's still good enough to get the ideas across and send messages and everything. So there's a lot of type 2 code talkers, as I'll explain a little bit later, but were incidentally formed and everything. The Marines, of course, started their Navajo program in very late April of 42, and right around the 1st of May left with the first 29 recruits to form their code talking program. And the Marines made really great efforts to keep this under TAPS. Even not sharing it with the other branches in the minutes of these meetings and things. The Marines are really being tight-lipped, even with the Army and the Navy and everything. So this is setting us up to go into World War II. So there's basically 2 types of code talking. So briefly revisiting World War I, when the Choctaw group was relieved, they were taken back to a rest camp. And the group was increased from 8 to 18 men and 3 non-commissioned officers. And they were given a week. And their assignment was create code terms for the things that you had trouble conveying or getting across. So things like poison gas, there's not a term for that traditionally in Choctaw. Things like tanks, things like there's a word for firearms, of course, but not machine guns, not different calibers, and not different calibers of artillery. So they spend a week training and creating these words, and they get the forms made, they practice and everything, but they finish this code development on November 10th of 1918. And of course, what happens the next morning? The armistice. So the Choctaws were getting ready to head towards Metz on the way to Sedan, but the war ended. So the code terms never got used. They were developed. But what's most important about this, I believe, they set the template. They set the idea of creating specially made up code terms in their native language that's then put into a largely unknown language as far as the enemy is concerned. So type 1 are the groups that have the coded vocabulary, and type 2 are just people who are using their everyday vernacular language to get messages across. But as we'll see in both wars, both were effective. They worked, and both of these are referred to as codes, both by the military and by the news press. So it's not necessarily as much of a code as we think in some of our Western European codes, but it still works as a code. It's a way of getting secreted messages across. So again, publicity everywhere. So we started recruiting these code talking groups before Pearl Harbor. And again, in hindsight, I'm sure this wouldn't fly today, but here, so here we are with 2 dates, one with the Chippewa and Oneida and another with the Comanche. And so December 13th of 1940, so this is almost a year before Pearl Harbor, and the other one was before that, August and everything. But again, Indians code upsets foe, speed dialect messages by radio and war games, but it identifies the unit, the tribes, those kind of things like that. even gives an idea of how they're doing it. And then on the other side, it identifies the Comanches, and it flat out says, we use this in World War I, and we're going to use it again and everything. So again, no secrecy. And these were reprinted and ran across the country. There's many different versions of it in the newspapers. So no secrecy again. Here's an example of another one. Now, these gentlemen have not been recognized yet. I'm trying to get some recognition for them. It is a group of Pima. The 158th was part of the 45th Division, but later on, our divisions used to have 4 regiments in them, and we triangulated for World War II. So the divisions went down to 3 regiments, and the other regiment got reassigned. Well, the 158th became a regimental combat team and went on its own direction. So the 45th went to Europe. The Thunderbirds of the 158th ended up going to Panama for training, and then eventually to the South Pacific. So this is a group in which there are several tribes. There are Apache, Maricopa, Navajo, Pima, etc. And I have found a considerable amount of information proving their use, training, everything. Both officers, firsthand interviews from officers I tracked down, as well as archival information. So this is another group. But again, Pima Indians have own code. So again, no secrecy trying to cover this up. So these are the Type 1 units in World War II, again, and just showing when they were recruited and everything. So again, one of the arguments I made in my initial book, The Comanche Code Talkers of World War II, was that this was really an underutilized resource. The low estimates of Native soldiers in World War II is 25,000, and the high estimate is 44,000. And I worked with a lot of this era of gentlemen, for several decades there until they began to pass. Groups, Comanches, Kiowas, Pawnees, Lakotas, etc., many groups, Navajo, Hopi, they had dozens and dozens of veterans. Some tribes had a few hundred men from their single tribe, 200 to 300 men in the armed forces that were fluent. The vast majority of them were fluent. So this is something that could have been actually expanded upon if it hadn't have been for the reticence of doing that. So long story short, missed opportunity, but hindsight is of course very easy. Here are the Meskwaki, again, in the newspaper, Army Indians to foil enemy listeners. And then these are the 8 men. They're a very small community. It was about 300 people at this time in Iowa. And out of that, 29 men enlisted one day for World War II. And then out of those 29, 8 were selected to be radio men and eventually become code talkers. So they will go into North Africa, experience Kasserine Pass and some of these conflicts, and then work their way on up into Italy later on. These are the Comanches, 15 to the 17 Comanches and everything. And so there were 5 gentlemen in this picture here that I was able to work with, as well as their officer. And of course, they're all gone now and everything. And but these gentlemen went to Fort Benning and took their basic and everything, and then advanced training, and then eventually radio work, and then given the assignment to form the code. And a little bit later, I'll explain how they actually came up with the code terms. Most of these guys are between 16 to 19. A lot of them were just fresh out of high school. Some of them actually left high school early with parents' permission, everything. They dropped out their senior year because of World War II, which was not uncommon for both natives and non-natives to be willing to serve at the time and everything. From their training, this is Wellington Mycobie. This is a switchboard. So they learned to do in a signals company for the 4th Division. So a signals company is basically 300 men, roughly, in a division of, somewhere around 12,500 to 15,000 soldiers. 17 Comanches were plugged into this and everything. So they learned to do everything. They could run a switchboard, run phones, they could wire, splice lines, they could climb poles, they knew Morse code, semaphore, everything you can imagine, radio, telephone, telegraph, you name it, everything. And one of them after the war came back and he was talking about, wasn't sure what he was going to do. And then he realized, I'll go work for the phone company. And so he went in one day and said he wanted a job. And they said, well, what makes you think you could have a job here? And he goes, well, I can basically do anything you all do. And they said, well, what do you mean? Can you lay line? He goes, no, I can do it all. I can run the switchboard. I can do this. So he worked for a time in the communications industry and everything, so good practical skill. And then this was Forrest Castavoid, again, a good friend of mine, but he had some he said, I have some goodies out back I want to show you. And he took this when they took Cherbourg and everything of that nature. This is a group of, again, small groups. There's one taking the picture, but there's 7 of these Lakotas. They are from different reservations across North and South Dakota. None of them knew each other before the war, but they all spoke a dialect of Lakota. So it was easy when they got together. They might have a slight accent like different Americans do, but they could understand each other fine. So they pulled these 7 men together, and they got the nickname MacArthur's Boys is what they became, because he did use them in some cases to send communications that needed to be sent with security and everything. A lot of what they did is 2-man teams would get ahead of the American lines, penetrate through the Japanese lines, go behind the Japanese, and secrete themselves. And then they did reconnaissance on everything, travel routes, troop strength, supply depots, etc. Radio that back in Lakota, and then immediately move your position so you couldn't be identified for location by the strength of the message. There was a way of kind of triangulating where messages come from based on their strength. And so it was a very hazardous type of work, but they all survived it, come back. But this was seven of these gentlemen here. These are some different photos. Floyd Dan is Hopi, and you can see he's there on a radio during training there. These other photos, the top one are 2 of the Navajo code talkers at Bougainville. The bottom one is another Navajo on Saipan, and you can see they worked in different settings. Sometimes you used a radio that had a small generator associated with it that was cranked and everything. In other cases, it was a backpack type radio that you changed batteries out of. You changed batteries periodically every so many hours, and the phone came right off your shoulder. So in some cases, 1 man could work it. In other cases, 2 and 4 man teams worked it and everything. But the advantage of this, of course, is it's as fast as I speaking to you, and you turn around and translate this into another language to the person sitting next to you, and the order can be handed off and goes into effect. And that's the beauty of it. There's not this slow coding and decoding that all the machinery takes for other types of code. These are the Navajo. They are the largest of the code talking groups. There was possibly as many as 420 that were trained or at least tested for training. We know roughly 285 saw combat, and there may be a few others that we don't know of because they were so large. This is them at Camp Elliott in their building. They were in a building they went to each day for several weeks. You couldn't take anything in, you couldn't take anything out. All the papers, materials stayed in the building. It was locked. It had 24-hour security with armed guards. You learned the code in there, and then you carried it in your head. But this is part of a class there working on the code, all Navajo. The top group there, 8 of these gentlemen are in a Marine regiment on Bougainville. And then the gentleman at the bottom again is Saipan. Now, what's interesting, if you start looking closely at some of these individuals, there's a lot of Japanese who began to be mistaken as Japanese. And I have a manuscript that's getting reviewed right now on this very subject. A lot of Americans, when they went into World War II, they had not traveled that far out of their home areas. There was no internet, not nearly the, not TV, not all this stuff that we have today. And a lot of them had never met all these other cultures, let alone all the different Native American cultures. And so we have situations in the Pacific where whites would mistake Navajos as being Japanese, because Japanese would infiltrate our lines, put on American Marine uniforms, and do what they could, get food, get supplies, get information, whatever. And of course we had people doing that. We had Japanese Americans that were helping us with communications and things as well. So it was not an unfounded suspicion. We also have other Native Americans that were not code talkers, but they were mistaken as Japanese. We have Asian Americans of several groups that, again, most Americans had never been around a Filipino, from a Chinese, from a Korean, from a Japanese. So there's a lot of ethnic misidentification. As soon as the person is cleared and the situation's remedied, they know that they're an American soldier and it's fine. The point's done. There's no residual maltreatment or anything. And the individuals were not killed. Luckily, they were captured and taken captive, and both sides kept their cool until they could be vouched for. But they were not allowed to tell lower ranking officers and things of their real purpose there. All they could say is, I'm a radio man. And only officers of a certain level up understood really what the code was about and everything. This is a sample of code words. And so the formation is pretty similar. Again, there was no master plan, but groups would, like, for example, the Comanche said, Lieutenant Foster made up a list of 500 military terms. Let's just start at the top. So, do you have a word for mountain? Well, of course, Comanches have a word for mountain. So there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Just use the regular word. Do you have a word for road, for river? Of course they do. But things that they don't have words for. So about 250 things they didn't, and that's what they created terms for. So they come to a tank, and they don't have a traditional Comanche word for tank. So they were in a kind of a Quonset hut with a bunch of folding chairs sitting around kind of in a circle. And he would give them the English term, and they would huddle together and talk in Comanche. Then they would turn around and say, okay, here's what we're going to call it. We're going to call a tank Wakare. Wakare. It's hard shelled, it's green, it's slow, it's like a turtle. That's what they analogized it to, right? And they went on other things. They, for example, the officer said, what's Comanche word for a gun? Davoy, Well, how about a rifle? Same word. How about a pistol? Same word. How about a shotgun? Same word. He says, no, this won't work. I need different terms for different calibers and sizes. So they came to the 30 caliber Browning machine gun. I need a term. So they huddled together, talking Comanche, and they turned around and they said, okay, here's what we're going to call it. We're going to call it Tutsakana Tavoy. And he said, what's Tavoy's gun? What's Tutsakana? He goes, it's a sewing machine. And they said, why would you call it a sewing machine gun? He said, well, back home, his mom's got this Singer, and you got to push the treadle down, pump the treadle with your foot, and it takes a little while to get up to speed, but it sounds like a 30 firing, like that. And then they came to the 50 caliber. And so again, they talk and they said, okay, we'll call that one Bia Tutsakana Tavoy, a big sewing machine gun. So they went down artillery, and they just called artillery the number of caliber. So 8 big gun, 105 big gun, etc. That's how they created terms. Well, again, the other side could listen to this. They had no idea what they're talking about, whatsoever. So these are other. If we could go back to that other slide just a second, please. So here are some others. The Hopis referred to a ship as a house on water, a pa'aki. A ship has a room to eat, a room to sleep, to exercise, to classroom. It has all these different, just like a house does. So they saw it as a house on water. A lot of the Navajo, for planes, they took different types of birds. And so they would analogize certain types of planes and its behaviors associated with just different species of birds and calling it. So a lot of groups, for example, like an owl, would usually be like a reconnaissance plane that's real quiet, slower moving, etc., that kind of thing. Something like a dive bomber or a strafing type plane, something more like a sparrowhawk or something like that. So you kind of get the analogy and everything. They also developed alphabets. And so let's say I need to say Paris. Well, if I say Paris, 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 anything like that, the whole world gets it. It's because it's so famous. So how do I talk about the names of particular units, German officers, town names, road names, without giving it away? And so they developed an alphabet. In Comanche, you would use the expression, now listen to me, in Comanche, and then you would just start spitting off a list of words. You took each Comanche word, translated it into English, and then took the first letter of the English to spell out what you were doing. So I might use the word for pear, like two of something, and then ant, rain, ice, snake. And I've just spelled Paris. So they could talk about, and they could use any word. It was interchangeable, any word taking the first translated letter. So you're never going to break that. There was no pattern to it. I could use the word mother's sister, like that kind of ant, one time for an A, and I could talk about an ant on the ground for the next time I want to use an A, but perfectly intelligible to the Comanches. The Navajos later on would develop an alphabet where they had select words for each specific chosen ones for each letter, but they soon realized the enemy would catch on to the patterning. So for most of the 26 letters, they developed 3 words. So you could just interchange those 3. So it's like memorizing 3 alphabets and everything. These are some of the Comanche words. So the sewing machine gun, the big sewing machine gun, a grenade was a small explosion. The mortar is interesting. They were figuring the word out for mortar, nako tu tavoy. And so it literally means a stove or a stovepipe gun. And they said, why do you call it that? They said, well, everyone knows his uncle back home, when he put in the wood stove, he cut the hole wrong. It's too far over. And so the pipe is kind of cockeyed at their house. So it reminded them of a mortar and everything. So they're just taking everyday things from normal life and creating code terms. And it doesn't really matter what the code term was, as long as only they knew it and everything. Telephone, they had a term metal talking, because the early phones were mostly metal and everything. And then, they even had a term for Adolf Hitler. They would refer to him as positivo, which means crazy white man. And so they could talk about him on the phone if they wanted to, and nobody would ever know the difference, you know. This is a group of Hopi who were in the 81st Infantry Division. They were culled and pulled together. And I did not get to meet any of these men. I worked with men in some of the other groups, but I got to talk to a lot of their children and the wives of some of them. And one of the interesting things I found out, they all spoke Hopi, but 3 of them were from the village of Tewa, which is on First Mesa, on eastern end of Hopi. And Tewa is another group that joined the Hopi some time back, like maybe 1600s or so. They have their own language. They have Tewa, but they also, over time, moving in with the Hopi and living there, become fluent Hopi speakers. So at Tewa, these men all grew up speaking Tewa first, Hopi second, English third. So 3 of them, when they spoke to each other, did it only in Tewa. When they spoke to the other 5, they spoke in Hopi and everything. So they were actually using 2 codes in a system of 8 men. So very ingenious use of that. This is a group that we stumbled onto recently. Well, not too recently, but more recent than the others. This family had a small shed out back that caught fire. They put the fire out. It wasn't much damage, but they had to take things out to do the repairs. And they remembered this trunk that their dad had. He'd get this trunk down, and there was the kids' toys in it and everything, but there was a little wooden box, and he'd never let anybody touch that wooden box. And the kids could play with all the toys, but he'd be over there in his chair somewhere. He'd look through the box. Kids never knew what was in it, and they didn't ask. Well, he died in 1970. fairly young, and that's the gentleman in the uniform up there. Well, 40 years later, when this fire happened, there's that little wooden box inside the trunk, and they get it out, and it's his medals, his ribbons, stuff from World War II, letters and things. And they come to 2 copies of a envelope that it's so old it's sticky, it's stuck together. So they steamed it on the stove to open it up. And if we can blow this picture up, this document is in there, and you see where it says secret top and bottom. And then you look around, and there's all these lines and numbers and names and tribes. So, for example, it says Samson Burden Ground, Crow, and he's teamed up with a guy, Lex Porter, Chippewa. We see Rex Puyuma, and that's the gentleman up here, the older gentleman in the photo. He is teamed up with Nelson Danford, who's Apache. 330, that's their bomb group number. And so these are pairs of natives which are strategically put in different bomb groups that can bounce languages back and forth. So if you notice, Nelson Danford is Apache, and he has an arrow going to Paul Burdett, who is also Apache. So Rex Puyuma then is linked up to Orville Wadsworth. They're both Hopi. So you can see where, like up at the top there, Joseph Day is Acoma. Acoma speaks the same language as Laguna. So he can send a message, Laguna to Acoma. He can tell the Hopi guy in English. The Hopi guy can bounce it to the other Hopi guy. He can tell it in English to the Apache. The Apache can then send it over to the Apache guy. It's ingenious. And we suspect there's Crow, Lakotas, several different tribes in this. We suspect there were probably speakers of most or all these languages at the base as well. And so the VBC in the middle is the 5th Bomb Command for the South Pacific. So these gentlemen were running bomb raids all over the Philippines, New Guinea, that area of the Pacific and everything. The Air Force has no knowledge of this, didn't know about it. He was not supposed to take the papers, but he took them, and you can see where he signed his name on the bottom and everything. But the Air Force said they were really glad that he confiscated these because they would have no knowledge of it whatsoever. What it makes me think of is how many other of these kinds of programs may have existed in out there somewhere, and we have no knowledge about. So when the family found the paper, Rex Puyuma was alive, and they just went across to the next mesa and talked to him and got the scoop on it, So the Hopi eventually contacted these families and pulled representatives from a lot of them together for a meeting. And I went out and spoke one year at Hopi for their Code Talkers Day, but they had a kind of a reunion, and none of the other families knew anything about this, and their fathers were all gone, This is just a brief chart of most, not all, of the World War II Code Talkers. But the important thing to realize is look at where they're at. They're in the Aleutian campaign. They are in Italy. They're in Europe. They're in New Guinea. They're on Luzon. They are all over the place. They're in Normandy, et cetera, and everything. They're in the Marine Corps in the Pacific. So there are small units, and you can see some of those units are just 2 or 3 men that were pulled together. And I got to visit one of the guys that experienced that. He was walking through an apple orchard in France shortly after D-Day, and he heard a gentleman singing. And the person singing was not just singing a song from his tribe. He was singing a specific type of song, a mourning song, which meant he had lost someone. So he made a beeline over to that guy. They'd never met. They didn't know each other. They started talking in Muskogee Creek, and an officer came by and said, "What are you guys doing?" And he said, "Well, I realized he's from my same group, and I heard him singing, and so we're just talking and getting acquainted." And he took their information down and said, "We may be in contact." And the old guy, one of these guys, he told me, he said, "I thought, in contact for what? We're nobodies. We're like a private and a corporal, kind of thing." And 3 days later, he got a note. "You're no longer with this unit. Report to such and such. Take all your gear." So he shows up, gives them the paper, and they said, "Wait in that tent right there. There'll be somebody here in a moment." When he opened up the tent, the other guy was in there sitting, and then an officer came and they made a radio team out of them, And so sometimes it was just happenstance, the way that they pulled these guys together. But yeah, these are a lot of the type 2 units and everything. Like I say, sometimes 3, 5, 7, 4 different numbers. But as long as you had 2 fluent speakers, you could have somebody in a key position and somebody further back behind, and you had a secure line of communications as fast as we're speaking now. Forms of recognition. Like I say, World War I, there wasn't any recognition beyond, just a lot of newspaper articles and things. So they kind of fall in 3 forms. There are things that tribes have done. There are things that the individual states have done. And then there's eventually federal recognition. And we've kind of ran the whole gamut. So in 1968, the Marine Corps 4th Division is having a reunion, and they decide they're going to recognize a lot of the Navajo code talkers because, as the war went along, they didn't have the term code talker until late in 44, but everybody understood why these guys were here. You have Native Americans who are talking only in their language on the phone to other Native Americans, and you can hear the other guys responding. It's obvious what they're doing. They're there to send messages, faster than the non-Indians can. And so they come to realize even during the war how valuable they were and the reason they were created. So the Navajo are going to be recognized, and their code is officially decoded by the National Archives and everything, or declassified by the military. And so the next year they're recognized, and then they form the Code Talkers Association in 71, which becomes very prominent. Later on, like in 86, the Hopi in Arizona had recognition of their code talkers, and everything. And then you started having some states do some recognitions. There was a recognition of Choctaw and Comanche in 86 a little bit, and then a bigger one in 89 at the Oklahoma Capitol. And then in federal, we're going to have 2 congressional gold medal acts. Not Congressional Medal of Honor, that's a combat award, but Congressional Gold Medal acts, one for the Navajo in 2000, and then one for all the other code talkers in 2008. So this is the Navajo Code Talker statue at Window Rock. If you ever get a chance to visit it, it's a wonderful place, and the museum's right over the hill from it. In the yellow and in the bottom picture, these are some of the Navajo Code Talker Association. They developed very unique uniforms, which ties into their religion, their origins, their symbolism. It's a whole wonderful story just to understand the colors and what they're wearing in the uniform. But they become very active in Veterans Day celebrations, events. They did things up at DC and California, like the Rose Bowl and this kind of stuff. And so they became very, very famous across the country and did a couple other things. They also did some scholarship raising kind of thing for education, but they also began to visit schools, and they did this for the rest of their lives, where they would go to public schools, colleges, high schools, etc., and just share their experiences and tell people about what they did, what it consisted of. These are some of the examples of the tribal recognition. This was the day I went out to speak. They had this plaque for the Hopi installed there, and there's 10 of them because there were 8 of them in the Army unit, and then there was the other 2 gentlemen that were in the Air Corps unit, but there's all 10 of them on this plaque here. The Choctaws had their own medal made in 86, and they got tired of waiting for something from let's go back, please. They were tired of waiting for the government to do something, so they took it upon themselves and made their own medal. And then the Choctaws put up a monument there in the lower left. The Comanches have their Spirit Talker statue, which is beautiful statue down at Lawton, Oklahoma. So like I say, the impetus is coming from the tribes first. And then in more modern times, there's been sections of highways. The Choctaw Code Talker Highway, the Navajo have one, the Comanche have one. There's several groups that have renamed sections of highway to commemorate the Code Talkers, and several tribes have their own statues now, for their Code Talkers. So there is a growing presence. This is when the Choctaw and Comanche were recognized by the state of Oklahoma and the French government. The French came over, and in Oklahoma City, because the Choctaw and the Comanche are both in modern day Oklahoma, and had special recognition for them at the capital there. And then there began to be like museum exhibits and things like that. So it's still relatively small, but it is increasing, just to try and raise the awareness of not just what they did, but how many different groups and where they came from and everything. So the Navajo are given the Congressional Gold and Silver Medals in 2001. 6 of the original 29 members were able to attend. We're still living and received the gold medal from President Bush. The others, families received it posthumously, and then the other code talkers were awarded silver. The second and other classes were awarded silver medals. And so that got, and rightly so. I mean, they were the biggest group. They had arguably, I would say, the biggest impact of anywhere of all the code talkers, just because of their sheer numbers and the nature of what they were able to achieve. But it got the other groups saying, well, what about us? Some of us were in World War I, some of us were in both World Wars. Navajo was really about the last group actually formed and everything. So there were many others that came before them but had not been recognized. So in 2002, I published a book on the Comanche Code Talkers, which dealt with other things on a national level. And shortly after that, I was asked to come up to a Senate committee hearing and testify everything for 15 minutes and present all my documents and things. So this is at the Dirksen building with the Choctaw Nation chief and the vice chairman of the Comanche Nation there. So I always joke and say I had my 15 minutes of fame on C-SPAN and it's all over now, But what this did was it kickstarted legislation later that fall. And eventually in 4 years, we got it through on the 4th time, the Code Talker Recognition Act of 2008, which recognizes all the other code talkers. So there's been 33 other groups recognized. And like I say, there's 2 others that I'm working on trying to get that recognition for them. There were medals designed. At first, there was going to be a standard medal for all the tribes. And the tribe said, no, we want to do something that means something to us. So they worked in conjunction with the U.S. Mint and in developing. So each Code Talker medal has things specific to their tribe, oftentimes language, some of their languages on it, symbols that relate to their clans or their identity, et cetera. So they're very individual medals. And I serve on this committee with the U.S. Mint on the Citizens Coinage Advisory Board. And we just completed another one for the next Code Talker group to be recognized, which hopefully will be out sometime later this year and everything. There was a medal ceremony in 2013. The gold medals were presented at the Emancipation Hall. So I went back up for that to cover that for my research and an article, and then a silver medal ceremony for all the tribes at the National Museum of the American Indian. And then I was fortunate enough, I was with some Lakotas, so we went up the hill, and South Dakota and North Dakota had their own just for the Dakotas. So I went to 3 different medal ceremonies. But the importance of this is there wasn't very many people left alive to receive these, but they will always be priceless to the families, the descendants, but also to the tribes. And most of these gold medals and things like that have been put into the either the tribal museum or the offices, etc. As protected, of course, but as a showpiece and a very rich part of their heritage. This is the one individual, and I talked to him before, and I got to visit with him again that day. The one individual that was physically able to come and receive his gold medal, and that's the gentleman that was walking through the apple orchard I told you about, and heard him speaking his language. And then this is the Choctaw contingent receiving their gold medal there. There's a popular cultural influence. Pendleton Blanket Company has made Navajo Code Talker blankets. There have been native comic book authors that have done educational comic books focusing on the Code Talkers. There's, of course, a dollar coin that is a code talker, and then a G.I. Joe doll that does Navajo. And for many years, I regretted not getting one because I was a full-grown adult, and I'm like, it's a G.I. Joe. I had those when I was a kid, but thank God for eBay. I've got one. So anyway, I take it into the class, and the kids love it because you get to hear 7 messages in Navajo as well as English, and it's by Sam Billison, one of the Navajo code talkers. So a great teaching tool. Wind Talkers, the movie, came out in 2002. Even making the script and working with the Marine Corps, they also worked with several of the Navajo code talkers. They knew that the plot was going to be changed. So the storyline is that these code talkers are put in with the Marines. And so they're afraid that they will be captured, compromised, the code will be broken. So in the movie, the plot is that the non-Indian partner or bodyguard is to kill the code talker if capture is imminent and everything. Now, that is compelling and a great storyline, sells a movie, but it's 180 degrees opposite. The rest of the movie is pretty much accurate. Guys that served on Saipan said, yeah, it's pretty similar to what we dealt with. The reality is the code talkers were placed in the units. They were getting mistaken and captured and held at gunpoint until sometimes 2-3 hours later they could be sorted out. And that prevented them from doing what they were there, which was this immediate messages. And so in reality, now they weren't being captured by the guys in their immediate company or platoon. It's when they would be coming back from running a message or out of their normal position. And like I said, there was a lot of infiltration in World War II. But the reality is they started sticking white guys with them just so they'd be left alone. If they're on the radio or running something and they've got this white soldier, nobody's even going to question them, and they might think they're native, Hispanic, who knows, but it was a moot point. And so that's the reality, is not all of them, but some of them that were mistaken ended up having bodyguards. Now that unfortunately would not sell a movie. But that's the reality of history, because again, most of these cultures never had been around each other and didn't, just wasn't familiar with other cultures. Why does this all work, right? Put it in a nutshell and we'll conclude here. So these languages are little known from a European and a Japanese standpoint, right? So even in America at World War I and II, there's very few people that are non-Indian that can speak these languages. Occasionally a missionary or somebody that runs a trading post near the area, etc. Occasionally a spouse that's married in, but very few people. So these languages are almost unknown. They're obscure, from that viewpoint. They're largely unwritten. Now, Cherokee, Choctaw, some of these languages had writing by this time, but it was mostly like for Bibles, hymn books. It was for local consumption, right? It wasn't things that you could go pull out of libraries in Paris or Berlin or somewhere like that. So they were largely unwritten. They're full, complete languages. They're not mathematical codes where I'm going to use a 2 to represent a 3 today. I'm going to use an A to represent the letter F. It's not that kind of consistent patterning. They're full languages. They're not European languages. So the syntax, the grammar is very, very different. And sometimes you'll have a whole expression that's like one great big long statement, which is like a whole sentence, whereas we chop and divide a lot of things up like that. So they weren't really comparable to the languages that Germany or Japan knew and everything. Now, later, when you place code terms in them, that makes it a double code. You've got coded vocabulary in an unknown language. It's a 2-layer code, Their advantages: speed and security. Again, as fast as you're listening to me, you turn around and put it back to somebody else, and the order can be implemented. None of the codes are broken. We do have Germans in World War I that inquired. They heard these languages. They said, we have the best linguists in the world. We know all the major world languages. What is this? And there's one case where they just laughed and they said, well, it's American, and they're not going to tell them, of course. There is a case of a Navajo soldier who was captured. He was in the Philippines before Japan attacked. And so there's actually a lot of Native American soldiers that got captured in Bataan. And at first they thought he was Japanese American. And so they're calling him a traitor. They're roughing him up pretty good. And he said, no, I'm an Indian, I'm a Native American, I'm a Navajo, leave me alone. So they put him in a work camp. They pretty much left him alone for a while. But later in the war, they came and pulled him out of there, and they made him listen to these tape recorded messages. And it was messages of the Navajo code talkers. Well, he was captured about 2 weeks before the first group was even recruited to get on the bus to go to basic. He had no knowledge of a Navajo code, of code talkers, or anything. So he understood it's Navajo, but he said it doesn't make sense to me. It's like gibberish. And so they didn't believe him, and they started torturing him and everything. But he could not break the code because he wasn't trained in it. And he was as fluent a speaker as any of those guys. So you either knew it or you didn't, and that was the beauty of it and everything. So again, it stayed classified till 68, but all the other programs, guys told me firsthand, face to face, they said, we were never told after the war, you can't talk about this, or, you didn't give it away during the war or anything, but there was never any real high security methods in the other branches and everything of that nature. These are just a few of the gentlemen I knew and worked with. Henry Stone Road, Pawnee, Clarence Wolfguts was Lakota. And then Chester Nez, the last of the original 29 code developers. And then Tom Holliday at the bottom. Tom was mistaken 3 times and captured for looking like a Japanese. And Chester was captured as well with his partner and everything. But some of the interviews I did with him. And again, the irony of all this is that most of these people, the vast majority, went through the government Indian boarding school, which strongly inhibited and physically punished and things like that the use of native language. So I have lots of stories from people when they're out on the playground. They put somebody at the corner and they'd be talking Comanche or Choctaw, whatever. And if somebody was coming, the person would whistle, and they all went into great English. And the teacher would come by and like, I'm so proud of you. That's just fine, practicing your English. And then, of course, as soon as they left, they went right back into it. So that was the beauty, was their resilience and ability to retain these languages, and then to, as I say, graciously share them with the rest of the country when asked to do it when the war came along. And that's the beauty of it. So I did this work it should be 2021. Did this work on all the groups in World War I, and I'm working on the World War II volume right now. There's so many more groups, but it's over the hump. It's getting closer to completion, And with that, like I say, there's still some groups I'm trying to get recognized. I still occasionally come up with new files and new documents, hunting across the country, and I'll just keep looking and find all I can and everything. But I thank you so much for your patience and your time, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions from anybody or visit with you, etc.
Thank you, Dr. Meadows. Anyone? Yes, please. If anyone has any questions for Dr. Meadows, we would just like to pass the microphone around. So please just raise your hand. If you have any questions, we'd be happy to come by your table. So be thinking if you didn't write them down. Well, thank you very much. Just a couple of quick notes. Thank you again for joining us, and we want to thank our program sponsors, the Eisenhower Foundation. We invite you to join us next month. You'll see the schedule of events are on your tables. Please take one of our flyers with you. Next month, we're going to learn more about atomic veterans. Doesn't that sound like an interesting topic? Glow in the dark, right? I'm kidding. As a reminder, there are surveys on the tables as well. And that really helps us. If you'll take a moment to jot down your thoughts, anything we can do to improve, or topics you would like to hear about, we would be happy to take your suggestions for those. And please do check out our website, eisenhowerlibrary.gov, no spaces. And you can also join our mailing list on the website as well. So thank you all for coming.